Uh, thank, thank you, Seeing, and it's really happy to meet you all here. And I like to share my screen. And yeah, where is it? Okay. Okay, so thank you so much for your participation, and thank you for all of you. And I'm really happy to meet you all here. I'm Xuran, and currently I'm based in University College London, and my research mainly focuses on the cognitive control and bilingual language processing. So today, I would like to share you two of my studies in my project. And these studies aim to investigate how bilingual language experience affect bilingual speakers' cognitive control in language processing. To start the presentation, let's quickly overview the background knowledge on cognitive control and bilingual communication. So we know that human communication actually is a complicated processes. It requires a series of mental control processes to realize specific communicative goals cooperatively. Well, in bilingual communication, bilingual's repertoires is jointly active, even one of them is not required to use at the current situation. So bilinguals not only have to solve the conflicts within linguistic repertoires within one languages, they also have to monitor and solve the conflicts between the two languages. So cognitive control, well, in a broader sense, it is a collection of cognitive processing. It's broadly regarded to mediate bilingual language control processes in both comprehension and production. So the interconnections between cognitive and language control have been intensively discussed and investigated in these years. And one point is commonly reached is that bilingual language experience or bilingual language processing as the most intensive, sustained, and integrity experience of human experience. It not only have the modulation effects on the language processing, but also on some aspects in nonverbal cognitive functions. So it just bridges the cognitive aspect and language aspect through the domain general cognitive control. So we have know there is a link between language processing and cognitive processing. So in the past decades, the hypothesis about bilingual advantage is a really heated discussed topic. That is, they think that bilinguals have the intensive practices of selecting appropriate language to use and controlling their linguistic interference among their co-activated languages. So bilinguals are supposed to have significant advantages on cognitive control as compared to their monolingual pairs. So such hypothesis has been investigated by numerous studies in 1990 to 2000 or the past decades. And yes, some labs do found some positive results, and they reported that yes, being a bilingual is super good, and it's good for individuals' cognitive development. But recently, more and more studies realize that it is really hard to replicate the previous evidence, especially to replicate the positive effect of the bilingual advantages. So more researchers began to think about the problems in the research. They began to think about why we cannot find the bilingual advantages anymore. So how can we redefine bilingualism? So they started to shift their research attention to within group analysis. They began to discuss the roles of language experience in bilingual cognitive control modulations. However, there is still no consistent results on which specific aspects in cognitive control are significantly affected by their long-term bilingualism experience. So in addition to the empirical studies, theoretical frameworks also evolved and developed in these recent years. We can say that a lot of theoretical frameworks in bilingualism research began to consider more on the effect of sociolinguistic factors, like the two very important theories you can see here, the adaptive control hypothesis and the control process model. These two models are very influential and important theories. They both discussed the effect of social linguistic factors in bilingual language processing and their cognitive control development. So adaptive control hypothesis, they point out that language control processes will adapt to the different cognitive demands posed by different interactional contexts. So they refer to the three different interactional contexts. In a single language context, languages are used separately in different situations. Like you use English at school, but use Chinese with your family members at home. And so as two languages are not co-used in the same situation, code-switching seldomly happen. So bilinguals in this context need to constantly monitor the linguistic computations and efficiently control the interference from their co-activated languages. So we can imagine that in this context, bilinguals need more cognitive demand on inhibition rather than the other aspects in the cognitive control. So in the dual language context, bilinguals use their languages alternatively in one situation, or they in the same situation, but they have different interlocutors, so they use the languages differently to different interlocutors. Like they speak Chinese with their Chinese friend, but they speak English in the classroom with their English teacher. So at this time, the two languages are co-used in the same occasion, but they still have some kind of code switching. This kind of code switching is happened at the class level. So they not only have to inhibit interference of the competitive languages, they also have to monitor and switch back and forth between the language items. Relatively stronger cognitive demands are required in this context compared to the single language context. Well, in the dense code switching context, it's really different. Bilinguals can use two languages at the same time in the same utterance freely with their partners. So you can imagine in the single utterance, they have two languages in the sentence and switch back and forth. So So in this context, they do not have strong inhibition requirement. Instead, they only need to switch between the two languages, and they feel relatively loose in the cognitive control. Well, 1 year later, Green and Li Wei also discussed the another model, the control process model. They think that in addition to interactional context, in fact, bilinguals' cognitive control also adapted to different kinds of code switching patterns processing. That means when bilinguals are going to process different kind of sentence, their cognitive control deployment is also different. They classified three different kind of code switching patterns like insertion, alternation, and dense code switching. And there are examples here we can see. So insertion is like they have matrix languages at the framework of the sentence, and then they insert some other languages words into the sentence. While the alternation is like what we say in the dual language context, they switch between languages at the sentence level. One sentence in English, the other sentence, well, switch to Chinese. While dense code switching is like the two languages are intensively blended in one sentence, and they switch back and forth all the time. And the key point is that they both discuss that the bilinguals' deployment of their cognitive control is dramatically changed, and their changing of the deployment is based on the interactional context and the sentence type. So after we have general background information about the bilingualism research, we come to today's studies. You can find here, I will mainly go through the two studies. Both of them discuss the roles of habitual language use experience in bilinguals' cognitive control modulations. But the difference is the first study here focus on bilingual comprehension process, while the second study focused on language production. And both of the two studies tested Chinese English bilingual adults living in the English-speaking countries. Okay, we first come to the language comprehension task. In this study, we aim to understand how interactional contexts that we have just reviewed before affect bilinguals' cognitive control, especially their inhibitory control in bilingual language comprehension process. So based on the two theories we reviewed before, the study expected to observe that participants in a dual language context will perform better on both inhibitory control and language comprehension. And Chinese, which is the dominant language of this participant, will modulate participant language comprehension abilities as well. So 36 Chinese English bilinguals were joined in this study, and out of them were Chinese Mandarin native speakers, and English is their second language. And at the time of the experiment, they have lived in London for about 2 years on average. And they all reported that they use two languages regularly in their daily life. Here is a general experiment procedure. Participants are tested through a battery of the cognitive assignment, like the working memory test and their digit spine. Sorry, as their sorry. Are there any questions here or?
Xuran.
Okay, so participants initially were tested through a battery of cognitive tasks, like their working memory and their fluid intelligence were measured to understand their baseline cognitive abilities, and their language proficiency was measured through the Lexile test. After this baseline measurement, this procedure is a formal experiment part. Participant inhibitory control performance is measured through the nonverbal flanker task, and in the formal experiment stage, they contain 3 testing sessions, the 3 different testing sessions. For each session, all participants should listen to a pre-recorded 3-minute dialogue, and then they need to answer 10 comprehension questions related to the dialogue they just listened immediately after they completed the flanker task. So each session's procedure is like that. Different type of dialogue in each session aims to imitate bilinguals' daily language comprehension practices and to induce their language comprehension and attentional status in the 3 different interactional contexts. So, well, each session is counterbalanced across participants. So in this page, I just put some examples of auditory and visual stimuli involved in the experiment. You can see here is an example of the dialogue listening material we used in this study. To imitate participants' single language context, we use the single language dialogues. The single language dialogue, that means they only have 1 language in this dialogue. The dual language context, we use the dialogue containing language switching, and this kind of switching is just like this one, so like switching from Chinese to English or switching from English to Chinese sentence by sentence. While in the dense code switching sessions, the dialogues you can see here is like a lot of words in two languages are combined together to imitate or create a context of the dense code switching. This part is the example of the flanker task. So in this task, participants are needed to identify the central atom's direction and ignore the directions of the surrounding atom. So for example, if they say this atom is the central atom is pointing right, so they need to press the right button and ignore the surrounding atom's direction. If all the atoms pointing to the same direction, this is a congruent trail. Otherwise, this is an incongruent trail. Okay, we come to the result very quickly, and we compared participant reaction time of the flanker task across different sessions, and we found that participant incongruent trails reaction time was significantly improved after they were immersed in the Chinese context and the dual language context. So this result seems like the dual language and the dominant language context have some modulation effect on their inhibitory control performance. Also, we found that as compared to the dense code switching context, participant inhibitory control performance in the dual language context were in general much better. So the result reflects the fast modulation effect of the dual language and dominant language context on their inhibitory control. However, such effect was not observed in their response accuracy. On the right-hand side is a result about their language comprehension. In the figure, we can clearly find that after they listened, after they do the flanker task, participants in the dominant language context can still have the highest correct answer rates in the language comprehension task. So it seems that the dominant language context have some effect help them to have better language comprehension, and their performance in the rest three contexts are comparable, and we did not observe some modulation effects of the dual language context on their language comprehension ability. So to recap the very direct and this more behavioral study, we found that as expected, the study provided some evidence for the modulation effect of the dual language context on bilingual inhibitory control during the language comprehension processes. Also, the present study shows the modulation effect of the dominant language on bilingual language inhibition and their language comprehension. So as for the significance of this small but very direct study, that it highlights the interconnections between language use context and the cognitive control in their language comprehension. So this is the direct evidence or some behavioral evidence from the language comprehension study. And followingly, this is a study we're going to discuss about their performance in the language production task. So in this study, which is quite similar because we have the similar kinds of participant, Chinese English bilinguals, but in this study, we would like to see how habitual language use affect participants' cognitive control in the language production. So besides the cognitive inhibition, we also measured participant cognitive shifting performance. And the study predicts that both bilinguals code switching frequency and L2 proficiency, these two factors are very important in modulating their language production behavior and their domain general cognitive control performance. So 31 participants joined in this study, and out of them are living in the English-speaking country at the time of the experiment, and they lived in their L2 environment for about 4 years. So I like to say this is a study carried online because we conducted this study during the pandemic, so we cannot use the lab, so we moved this study online. Here is the study procedure. At the beginning, this measurement is to collect participant language learning background, language use habits, and their language proficiency. This part is about the formal experiment stage. 2 nonverbal cognitive control tasks and 1 language switching task were involved, and the bilingual picture naming task is used to measure participant language switching performance. The go-no-go task aim to measure their response inhibition performance, and the color shift switching task we used to assess participant cognitive shifting performance. The 2 nonverbal cognitive tasks were counterbalanced across participants and are always completed after the picture naming task. And here is the procedure for each task in this study. The picture naming task here require participants to name the object they saw on the screen in Chinese or English based on the background color and the flag cues. In the color shape switching task, participants need to make a color or shape judgment to the stimuli they see based on the cues. So at the top of the screen is the cues. While the last task, the go-no-go task, participants need to press spacebar when they say a mouse appears on the screen. If they saw an albigens appears on the screen, they need to immediately withhold their response and do nothing. Now we come to the result again very quickly. So in the picture naming task, participants, we can say red is the Chinese trials. Participants performed comparable reaction time in Chinese and English namings when they are required to name the picture in Chinese and English only in the single language trials. But participants took more time to switch from English to Chinese. However, participant reaction time for English repeated trials were significantly smaller than their Chinese repeated trials. As for their response accuracy, we found that participants performed more accurately in Chinese monolingual trials as compared to English monolingual trials. Well, this result is quite obvious because Chinese is more dominant and they are more fluently in naming pictures in Chinese. Well, then we found that participants performed higher accuracy for English repeated trials compared to their Chinese to English switching trials. And here, let's say the cognitive shifting task result. In this figure, we found that as compared to the switch trials, participants respond faster in these non-switch trials, because in switch trials, they need more cognitive efforts to monitor the stimuli and to decide which button they need to press. So more reaction time were required in switch trials. So their reaction time was smallest in the single task trials. Participant response accuracy were comparable across different tabs and trials. On the right-hand side is a result from the go-no-go task. In this task, participant unsuccessful percentages of response withholding in the no-go trials were calculated. So this variable is called the false alarm percentages. So the general result is that we found that participants tended to perform more mistakes in the no-go trials as compared to the go trials. Now let's come to the most exciting part of the study, the regression analysis result. The first question is about the relationship between language use habits and participant language switching production. So this model, the multiple regression model, showed a positive relationship between participants' contextual switching frequency and their switch cost in Chinese naming. So the contextual switch frequency here indicates the frequency of switching languages based on different contexts. So in general, the model reflects that bilinguals who prefer to use languages separately or switch languages based on context would perform less proficiently in language switching tasks. So this is reasonable, and this makes sense because habitual single language context bilinguals were not efficient in reactive inhibition in linguistic interference during their language comprehension. So, in language production. So they less they switch in their daily life, less proficiently they perform in the picture naming task. Apart from the switch cost, the green part is about their mixing cost regression analysis result. We found that bilinguals higher frequency of using L2 outside home is associated with their smaller mixing cost to Chinese. And such effect is more predominant among unbalanced bilinguals with less proficiency in L2. So from the demographic information of these participants, we see that they habitate to use L1 in home settings, but they prefer to use L2 in other settings. So the more intensively they use L2 in situation rather than home indicates that they are higher frequency of single language context in engagement. So the two model, in fact, jointly indicate that instead of reactively inhibit their linguistic interference to facilitate their fluent language switching, these habitual single language context bilinguals are more experienced in language maintenance and in language proactive inhibition rather than switching between languages. And so this set of results are for the relationship between bilinguals' cognitive shifting performance and their habitual language use. The multiple regression result here shows that bilingual with less English proficiency, but with intensive engagement into the single language context will perform less efficiently in the color shift switching task. And here is the Bayes regression model, which also shows a very consistent result. In general, the results were in line with the study hypothesis. That is, behavioral outcomes on cognitive shifting are trained through bilinguals in intensive practices of language switching. Those who seldomly switch or co-use their languages in communication did not show such effect. In other words, these bilinguals habitat in the single language context, and they have less experience in code switching, so they may not outperform in the cognitive shifting task. Finally, let's see the relationship between participant response inhibition performance and their habitual language use experience. The multiple regression analysis results show that participants with higher unintended switching frequency tended to have better performance in the go-no-go task. So the smaller percentage of false alarm here indicates a better response inhibition performance. Such finding was actually inconsistent with what previous study reported, where higher unintended switch frequency was broadly reported to reflect bilinguals' uncontrolled activation of non-target languages during communication, and it should correlate it with their worse performance in cognitive inhibition. But interestingly, in our study, we noticed that participant unintended switch frequency is an important index of this participant dense code switching frequency. That means those dense code switchers, they also have higher frequency of unintended switch. So it seems like to reflect the habitual dense code switchers, they adopt a relatively loose control on their two languages to produce efficient intensive code switching back and forth in their communication. And such dense code switching experience further facilitates their response inhibition in a broader way. So in general, the study shows the evidence to support the modulations of frequent code switching on bilingual response inhibition performance, and bilingual's proficiency in cognitive shifting, interference control, and conflict resolving is suggested to be trained through their intensive code switching practices. Those single language context bilinguals are proficient in proactively controlling their language interference and maintaining the target languages. So they are fluent in monolingual utterance production, and they are not good at cognitive shifting. So before we come to the very end, here are the points I would like to highlight. The first thing is bilingualism, in fact, is a lifelong, continuously developing experience, and it is not the add up of two monolingual experience. Then it is the very important things I would like to highlight, and that is a code switching actually is a very, very common pattern in bilingual speech. Anyone who has the ability to use more than one languages in their daily communication is, or broadly speaking, can be discussed or classified as a bilingual. So code switching, in fact, is just a very normal communicative behavior for nearly everyone in current society. So it's not a bad behavior, it's not a taboo in our communication, and it, of course, does not destroy the so-called language purity. And there is no so-called language purity in research. The last point here is for the future work. We would like to highlight that language context or something more in the social linguistic areas are important in the bilingualism research, and they are important in modulating bilinguals' language production, language processing patterns, and their cognitive control performance. So more studies are needed with accounting for these factors in future. So that's all, and thanks for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Xuran. Okay.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Now to the question time. Sorry, okay. Comes to the question time. Any question from the audience? You can switch on your audio directly.
Hello, Xuran. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you.
Hi, Xuran. Thank you for your talk. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So thank you for very impressive and informative talk. I have some questions. The first one is, I think in your first study, the dense mixed Chinese and English condition is very interesting. My question is, what's the rationale of creating such condition? Because it happens in our daily life a lot, and it's very an interesting phenomenon. And what motivates you to create such condition? And also in this condition, there are some English words inserted in these Chinese sentences. And how did you manipulate the frequency of English words?
That is a quite nice question. Well, the rationale for design these different contexts is that we would like to imitate a context that these bilinguals usually immersed in their daily communication. So, well, we need to say that there is no perfect naturalistic context because everything is in lab. So we try to make sure our dialogue design is naturalistic approaching, but it's actually some artificial dialogues or artificial switchings in these dialogues. But we aim to do is to manipulate bilingual's attentional control or language processing status in different contexts. So we designed different kind of dialogues, and to control their word frequencies of Chinese and English, we use the corpus. We try to balance the word numbers and switching tense in these dialogues, make sure they have similar tense of switching, they have very comparable frequencies of the English words and Chinese words in the daily use. And actually these dialogues, the content of this dialogue is all about our daily lives. We did not include anything related to academic or something very tricky to understand. We just created some dialogues based on our daily communication, like what did you do this week, or what's your favorite activities or your sports. It's like that. Yeah, try to make it naturalistic, but yeah, it's still a lab-based experiment.
Yeah, thank you for elaboration. I think it's very interesting. Recently I read an article from Professor Ding Guosheng's lab in Beijing Normal University, and they did a experiment about the within sentence code switch, and it's just like the materials in your dense mixed condition. It's very interesting. I think it's an interesting area, and which merits further investigations and examinations.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the second small question is about the language proficiency measurement in your study too, because I also use the Lextel the proficiency indicator in my experiment, and I correlate their lexical scores to their neuroimaging markers. And even though this test has been validated in a lot of studies, but it's still challenged by someone. So my question is, what's your so how do you what's your stance, what's your take on this Lextel score for measuring L2 proficiency in your study?
So we just z-scored their language proficiency because the Lextel result is the percentages. So we just transform them to no, we just use the percentages and then transform them into the z-score, standardize them. But besides the L2 proficiency, we think that language dominance is another thing that's very important in bilingual's development, because Lextel tests mainly focus on those highly or medially highly bilingual language learners or second language users. So you cannot ensure that every participant in your sample have that kind of high standard language proficiency. So we used the self-reported questionnaires to measure their language proficiency, and we also measure their language dominance, and we use the LeapQ, the questionnaire, to measure their perceptions on their L2 ascent, to make sure that these different measurements have quite comparable results in indexing their language proficiency. Because Lextel, the reason why we choose Lextel test is that our participants have quite a long duration of immersion into the L2 environment, and we think that they have relatively high proficiency in L2, and both of them, they took the IELTS or TOEFL test. So we know that their language proficiency at the baseline is quite comparable. So we use this test, but there are still some outliers. We need to we then to focus on more on their language dominance to say how frequently they actually use L2 in their daily life, because some people, even they have relatively high L2 proficiency initially, but they do not use L2 intensively in daily communication. They might have some impact on their frequency. So we also take the variables about how frequently you use L2 in your daily life. These different variables together to capture a relatively full picture about their language proficiency. Yeah.
Thank you for your elaboration. It's very impressive because L2 proficiency have it's been an enduring challenge or difficult in L2 studies, and you combine them into one continual variable. It's very impressive. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Okay, sure.
I can't hear you.
Wait, I saw you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Qingbo, you can speak up now.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool.
Hello, Qingbo.
Strange. Yeah, it's quite strange. Sorry.
You can ask a question now.
I just want to ask a really quick question because I noticed that you are
first
using.
Unmute yourself, whether you can operate.
Sorry, you can hear me now, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, because I noticed that.
I saw you raise your hand up.